Hello, Ophélie. It is lovely to have you with us. Unfortunately for our viewers, we had some super fun times just before we went live. But maybe you would like to introduce yourself for those of our guests at home this evening.
So, hello everybody, my name is Ophélie. I'm currently working as a Junior Policy Advisor at the Diversity and Inclusivity Office at Maastricht University. We did have indeed a nice little internet cutout about 5 minutes before we went live, and that just involved me running around the house being like, the internet is down. Everybody's saying, yes, the internet is down, we can do nothing about it. And I'm glad that we're ready to start.
So, Ophélie, you're a slightly different guest from our usual guests, being slightly more practically oriented. Maybe for our viewers at home, you can explain what a Junior Policy Advisor does.
So, for me, a Junior Policy Advisor at the D&I office means that I work with my colleagues at the Diversity Office on a range of projects, ranging from policy and writing policy to events such as our Diversity Day, the launch of the Parents and Carers Network yesterday, and working with organisations such as UN Pride, ACNUS, and our other D&I organisations. So lots of different things, not just one definition, I would say.
Well, it sounds like you keep yourself busy. Are there any that you'd like, of the projects you work on, that you'd like to speak about that you find particularly interesting, especially for inclusivity in a broader sense at UM?
I'd say one of the current ones that is really a broad inclusivity issue at UM is the focus groups that are coming up soon. So we had the student experience survey a couple of weeks ago. Any of our Maastricht University students watching will maybe remember the pop-ups in the student portal that came up, and we asked questions about inclusion over various aspects at UM, both physically and online. And so we've used that for structuring our focus groups that are going to be taking place at the end of November. So we're going to be focusing on accessibility as the main factor, but also generally looking at how the online environment of UM, so both lessons online as well as the portals that we use, and how those work for everybody, and how we can make sure that those are an inclusive space for everybody working and studying at Maastricht University.
Well, thank you very much for introducing your almost multifaceted job that solves all the problems that UM faces, obviously.
All of them, absolutely all of them.
Just a superwoman. So maybe you'd like to introduce what you're going to talk about this evening a bit, and why it's such an important topic, the use of gender and sex, both in research but also in everyday parlance.
Yeah, so the idea is that gender and sex, and also sexuality, which we'll come on to later, are things that we tend to always ask, especially in research, but also when you're creating an event or anything like that. It's the type of information that we automatically ask without necessarily questioning whether it's the right thing to ask or what we're going to do with that information. So specifically in the case of research and science, any questionnaire that you fill out, and even if it's qualitative data and you're talking to people, it's the type of information that tends to be noted, and then you group people into these categories when you're doing your analysis. And that seems like something that we just do automatically without really questioning why. And so that's why I wanted to take more of a critical look at how we use gender in research and science, and why, and if we really need to.
And so maybe a useful starting point for all of our listeners at home would be if you could briefly expand on what the differences between sex, gender, and sexuality are.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll break it down step by step. Sex refers to a combination of different biological attributes such as chromosomes, hormones, physical features, gene expression, and anatomy. And this is often simplified into two different sexes, male and female. There is more than that, but for now, we'll go with this because most people will understand it as this. When we move on to gender next, it's more about self-expression and identity with regards to how the world around us and sees us, and how we see ourselves fitting in that world and environment around us. So for the models that we see, relate to our own identity and what we can identify with. So this can include man, woman, non-binary individuals, and many other categories that best define people for themselves. And then lastly here, sexuality refers to the people you are attracted to and who you want to date. So that is often a combination of how you identify and how the people you are interested in and want to date or identify. But that is different to gender and sex.
Well, thank you very much for that brief introduction. I think it almost gives us all a level playing field on which to understand the rest of it. And you were saying that this is obviously a very important topic within scientific research, but it does have much broader implications, not only in education, but also in the world around us. Maybe you could expand on why it's important to properly characterize sex and gender, though, when you are undertaking research specifically.
So undertaking research that is not actually related to sex or gender, so assessing sex and gender and sexuality, looking at sex or gender or sexuality are things that researchers do often need to consider because it also plays a role with how we interact with the world around us and things like that. So often, you will have that question because we do want to evaluate how different groups interact or how different groups are affected by a particular factor and things like that. So that's where it does play a role. But then we reach our first hurdle, which is what categories we give people for that and what we're actually looking at. So most of the time we fall into the trap of looking at saying gender, but then only having male and female or even man and woman categories. At this point, you're asking people something about themselves, but it's not necessarily what you think you're asking because we're not always clear about what we're asking. And you're very much limiting the range of people that you can have in that group. So it's nice to know, also asking people what their favorite color is or what their favorite fruit is to categorize people into groups, but you need to have enough groups so that you can actually get a representative idea of the people that you are asking and what your population is like, what your sample is like.
So from your own experience, how is it currently being done in terms of categorizing people, and what needs to change such that it's almost more inclusive and more able to facilitate proper academic discourse?
So currently you will often find male and female, if you're lucky, a little box that says other, but then when it comes to analysis, that little box that says other is probably just cast aside because it's not representative of the whole sample, often because people who will not identify with male or female or man or woman probably don't want to answer that questionnaire after that. If you're just putting a little bit of an other box, that's just something put aside. So the first thing to do would be to have more options that entice people to answer and then continue to fill out this survey, this questionnaire, because they feel like they are included in this. And this is information about them that is valuable, and the rest of their opinions, etc., are worthy of their time, and because they will be listened to. The biggest trap is that we see man, woman, and sometimes other, a lot of the times not. And this is also then seen in all of the analyses that we have in the results and research, which will always only talk about men and women. And aside from any studies specifically about gender, which will look more into trans issues or non-binary and gender and sexuality in general, you don't see that inclusion of anything other than just man and woman in the research and in the topics and in the papers that are written. So it kind of means that everything in psychology that does not have other options is super limited. We are excluding a huge population by just always having man and woman and nothing else. And everybody, regardless of gender, has emotions, experiences, favorite colors, opinions of what they want to buy in a supermarket, lots of business cases political cases in any subject, in any side of academia, you have topics that apply to all people, not just men and women and people who identify within the small realms of those labels.
Yeah, it's a very limiting box you're then casting everyone into. And I know quite regularly, especially in feminist discourse, you see a lot of complaints about the fact that actually they go to the effort to categorize and then will often just discard that information, which almost also polarizes the following questions, but actually then doesn't provide any benefit to the research. So surely one needs to almost sit down and critically reflect on why they're asking this question and how they're asking it to provide an actual effective mechanism to properly learn from the answer being given.
No, exactly. Like we have, I think the statistics were for, at least in the Netherlands, 1% of young people saying that they did not identify with the labels male or female. And you'd say 1% in a sample. That's, a really, really small percent. But when you're looking at the world as a whole, 1% of the world is not a small number of people. And when you have research that has huge implications with psychological therapy, or even just how people, how things are marketed to people, how people buy things, everything like that, 1% of a population in this case is not negligible, and these are populations that we need to consider.
Yeah, and obviously you brought up sexuality earlier, and maybe you could talk further about how this almost directly flows from the problems experienced in researching sex and gender into problems classifying and contextualizing sexuality within this spectrum.
Yeah, so one of the easiest examples, I think, to bring up here would be in developmental psychology. So you have a lot of studies looking at how parents bring up their children. But this is pretty much always a mother and a father. And if it's not, then it's a particular case looking at homosexual couples, for instance. So you have all these generalizations being made about how a child will grow up with or with a father and a mother, and the effect of the interactions with their father and the effect of the interactions with their mother. And yeah, that's first of all a very limited sample in terms of sexuality, but then this leads on to also excluding single parent families and other family dynamics that you may not expect, but are very, very normal. So that's one of the things. Then another particularly favorite examples of mine is a study that was called The Evolution of Female Same-Sex Attraction, the Male Hypothesis, which essentially looked at over 1,000 heterosexual people and asked questions to conclude that female same-sex attraction is because heterosexual men like the idea of it. So
phenomenal.
Yeah, it's really that thing's like, it was conducted by a heterosexual man as well. But it's really one of those situations of, yeah, we're studying the evolution of female same-sex attraction. And if you do ask heterosexual men about this, yes, it's about them. Plot twist, it's really, really not.
I mean, I hate to be facetious here, but if you ask a heterosexual man about anything, won't he say it's got to be about him? Is there a worldview in which it's not about him?
Yeah, exactly. But this study warmed my heart for all the wrong reasons. But yeah, so it's one of those examples of like, yeah, you're asking people the wrong things. You're asking the wrong people the wrong things. And in the same way that heterosexual men are probably not the people to ask about female same-sex attraction, you have
hopefully no heterosexual men are watching.
Well, but you also have to ask everybody, parents of all sorts, parents who are in same-sex relationships, parents who are non-binary, about how their child grows up, and you have to also study how these children grow up as people, and not only specifically as children of homosexual couples, for instance, because that's not necessarily something that is a big issue when you're just looking at how well they're doing in mathematics or in science or their development and social interactions with other people. There may be some cases where it is relevant, and you do want to compare the effect of, I don't know, Reese having same-sex parents on tolerance towards other people. That might be a really interesting thing. But the relevance of same-sex parents on mathematical ability, if that's what you're looking at, that's beginning to be a little bit questionable. And I'm not saying that there are tons of studies looking on the effect of having homosexual parents on your mathematical ability, but it's these connections that we tend to make with, same thing with gender, of like, oh, okay, so yes, people who are female are better. There was another one I saw recently, are more naturally appropriate leaders for the 21st century. Like, I mean, yeah, that sounds great, giving female leaders a reason to be great in the 21st century.
But if that's true, why weren't they appropriate up until the 21st century?
That's another question. But why is this a question that we're asking? Why are we, again, dividing this on gender when we should be looking at what characteristics make people good leaders in the 21st century?
And why, when gender should come into it, why are almost other genders being excluded from being widespread leaders? Not, well, theoretically they'd make a great idea. Let's parade this around and pretend the world's perfect.
Right? It's just, yeah, it's one of these things it's not necessarily information that we need to have because we are excluding a lot of people with that. If we were better at asking about gender to begin with, maybe we could make more generalizations that would be super duper accurate. But for now, it just seems like we're really not there yet. And I think there are much better things we could be asking people and better things that we could be researching that might lead to better models. And I think that's also the next thing that's really important, is that we base a lot of science and research on previous science and research. And a lot of that is great because they've done a lot of the work so that we don't need to do that. But if we're repeating those studies and those ideas, but still having only men and women as categories, you're, again, excluding a huge population, and you're doing yourself and your research a disservice. It doesn't take a lot of time to be like, okay, what's the relevance of looking at gender here? What will we gain from it? Will this be different to what we previously knew about this? Or could we maybe find out something more valuable by having more than just men and women involved? Or just asking other questions? We have a lot of stereotypes attached to gender, and those tend to then play into what we expect in our hypotheses. So we use stereotypes there. We could break those down, look at the characteristics that you're stereotyping and why, and maybe start to use that to assess what you want to assess and what you want to research.
Well, I shall just inform you at this moment that there appears to be much love in the comments. It's unclear if they're laughing at us or clapping at us or just crying.
Right, okay, crying's in 2020 mood. We'll go for it.
If they would like to ask questions, I would like to remind them they're more than welcome to. But you said just there that actually a lot of it is repeating research on the same almost poor premises. Surely if that's the case, you must almost have an inclination to want to go and research yourself on why such terminology is used and why it's used poorly, and how research can be improved and be more inclusive. So do you ever feel that it's time to put out your more practical gloves and go out with a magnifying glass, look at the world?
Part of me does want to do that, because if there was something that I could do to guide science and research into a direction that is more inclusive, that would be really, really cool. But at the same time, there is a lot of ground field work that is really nice, and for now it's very, very satisfying. And I think when I was writing my master thesis, I was driven nuts by how people refer to gender in papers and in science, and that is one of the first things that led me to looking at jobs in diversity and inclusion, being like, this is exhausting. I'm not sure I could work in an environment where these small ideas or these very, very small concepts are just kept small and not expanded upon. So if I could work in research where I would somewhat dismantle that would be really nice. But I think I would struggle to go back into research if I was always dismissed because of smaller samples or including smaller percentages of a sample because I have more than men and women as categories for my research.
So I think it's almost time for a mini round of applause because I think I've received my first ever question from the audience.
Wow, yes.
Yes, from Thomas, who asks, would Ophélie have any clear-cut ideas on how research could be improved?
So research could be improved by firstly being a lot more critical when we define our research. So when you sit down and look at your research question and your hypotheses, if gender is relevant there, then absolutely include it, and preferably include more than 2 options. If you need help with that, always contact us. We'll figure something out. If you're ever looking for what options do I need to include, there are always people to talk to, and I'm sure you and Pride will also be keen to have some input there. If you find that your hypothesis has absolutely nothing to do with gender, then you probably don't need to include it. And it's a good exercise to think about, if you do want to include it, what are the characteristics that you're looking for? Are you stereotyping gender, or are you looking at it from a gender assessment point of view? So being more critical of our own work and also of our peers' work when we are peer reviewing or anything like that is probably the best way that we have of doing better in science and research when it comes to using and assessing gender.
And almost directly on that, do you think that as sex and gender become more common usage in terms of, because I at least get the feeling that some people use them in almost analogous situations, where I definitely see that in younger groups of people they're more clear on the distinction between the two. Do you think as society becomes more clear on that distinction, actually it will inherently get better over time?
I'd like to say I hope so. I think there is still a lot of work to be done, both in understanding the differences between sex and gender and the implications of that as well, because there is a different implication in a psychology setting as there is in a medical setting, where you do need to understand the human body, anatomy and hormones. And if there are artificial hormones being taken, things like that, those are always things that can be asked, but in a sensitive way that are gender affirming, and get you the right scientific information that you need and the right identity information that you need, so that you are representing people in their true self, not in the idea that you have of them.
And as we come towards the end, maybe you can say what kind of main takeaways you feel you've learned almost from this, both from a research perspective, but also from your more practical application in D&I.
I think the biggest thing that I've learned is that you cannot expect to guess correctly. The best thing is to ask people, and also if you are unsure about what to use, whether it's in a questionnaire or whether it's talking to somebody, just asking and informing yourself by reading up on things and asking people in a polite and respectful way is the best way to learn. I can't speak on behalf of anybody but myself in terms of how I would like to be identified in a questionnaire or in research. But the more people we ask and the more we involve the right communities for anything, whether it's research on gender, sexuality and sex, or if it's research on anything else, you need to be open to talking to people and taking that time to learn and reflect on what other people say. When it's not your experience, your job is to take a step back and appreciate any input you get from someone who tells you anything about themselves or gives you that opportunity to learn.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time out to speak with us. I think our audience have enjoyed it greatly. I have also enjoyed it greatly.
Good.
So I think on that note, we shall stop then. I just need to...
Great. Thank you very much. Cheers.